You guys today, DiJonai Carrington, after clotheslining Sophie Cunningham, running into the locker room, screaming, "That's white privilege!" Then tweeting 8/23, threatening Sophie Cunningham and the Indiana Fever. DiJonai Carrington now comes out and clarifies what she means when she says white privilege for the Indiana Fever.
So with 2 minutes left in the first quarter, DiJonai Carrington just slapped the dog shit out of Sophie Cunningham. Sophie pops up. She's obviously upset. DiJonai says, "Try me." And then look at Stephanie White. Look at her face. Look. She's mad as shit. Now, number one, this is obviously a flagrant 2. It just is. By the letter of the law, you got to call a flagrant 2. We all know these refs are not.
That girl needs to be thrown out.
DiJonai Carrington is having a complete meltdown, and the WNBA has turned on her after the brutal attack on Sophie Cunningham, and the basketball world is watching something unfold that has no precise precedent in the institutional history of professional women's basketball, because the specific nature of what a meltdown looks like when the most significant institutional forces in professional basketball's governance and commercial ecosystem have simultaneously turned against a single individual. In the aftermath of the most severe single conduct violation the Clark era's most dramatic governance accountability season has produced is something that the standard sports media framework for covering individual player controversies is simply not equipped to capture in its full institutional and human complexity. The WNBA has turned on Carrington. The Accountability Coalition has turned on Carrington. The franchise that employed her has fired her. The most prominent voices in professional basketball have not held back about what she did to Cunningham. And the meltdown that the accumulated weight of all of those simultaneous institutional and public turning against forces has produced in the individual at the center of the most severe single conduct violation in the Clark era's governance accountability story is the human and institutional event that everything the accountability story has built toward has now concentrated in its most personal and most individually devastating form. Today I am breaking down exactly what the meltdown involves and what the specific form of Carrington's response to the WNBA turning on her in the aftermath of the brutal attack on Cunningham reveals about the institutional and personal experience of being at the center of the most comprehensively criticized single individual conduct situation professional women's basketball has ever produced, why the WNBA turning on her specifically and institutionally represents something different from the standard professional basketball response to individual conduct violations, what the meltdown tells you about the human and institutional dynamics of a situation that has produced simultaneous accountability pressure from every institutional level of the professional women's basketball ecosystem, and what the complete institutional turning against that Carrington's meltdown reflects reveals about where the governance accountability story is in its most consequential chapter. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark I am going to show you the specific element of the meltdown that every outlet covering the story has been treating as the most dramatically compelling moment, when it is actually the most analytically significant moment and the one that reveals what the WNBA turning on Carrington most specifically tells you about the institutional state of women's basketball governance at its most consequential single moment. The institutional turning against DiJonai Carrington in the aftermath of the brutal attack on Sophie Cunningham has been the most comprehensive simultaneous institutional response to a single individual's conduct that professional women's basketball has ever produced. And understanding what the meltdown that comprehensive turning against has produced requires understanding both the specific institutional dimensions of what turning against means at each level of the professional basketball ecosystem and the specific human experience of being the individual at the center of that comprehensive simultaneous institutional response. The Accountability Coalition's turning against, which we have documented in detail across the previous videos covering LeBron James destroying Carrington, Barkley not holding back, Steph Curry not holding back, Cheryl Miller exposing Griner, and now applying that same institutional authority to the Carrington situation, represents the most institutionally authoritative and the most commercially significant simultaneous multi-voice turning against that any individual in professional women's basketball has experienced. The WNBA's turning against, which we have documented through the official band's formal confirmation and the strongest message in the league's institutional history, represents the most formally severe and the most institutionally complete league governance turning against that any individual in the Clark era's governance accountability story has experienced. The franchise's turning against, which we documented through the Chicago Sky's firing and the coach's enough statement, represents the most proximate organizational turning against, the response from the specific organizational environment most directly responsible for the competitive conditions in which the conduct that produced the brutal attack on Cunningham was developing. And the basketball world's turning against, which is the aggregate of every fan, every analyst, every competitive voice, and every commercial stakeholder whose response to the brutal attack on Cunningham has contributed to the comprehensive public institutional environment in which Carrington's meltdown has been unfolding, represents the broadest and the most personally inescapable dimension of the turning against that the meltdown's most dramatic expressions are most directly responding to. The meltdown is the individual human response to the specific experience of all of those simultaneous turning against forces converging on a single person in the most publicly documented and the most institutionally concentrated form that professional women's basketball has ever produced. Let us start with what the meltdown specifically involves, because the precise nature of Carrington's response to the WNBA turning on her is the analytical foundation of everything that follows, and the mainstream coverage has been treating the dramatic intensity of the meltdown without adequately examining the specific form of the response and what that specific form reveals about how Carrington is processing the full, institutional and personal weight of the comprehensive simultaneous turning against the brutal attack on Cunningham has produced. The meltdown is not simply the emotional frustration of a player who has received a disciplinary consequence she believes is disproportionate to the conduct that produced it. It is the specific and complex human response to the experience of having the most comprehensive simultaneous institutional turning against in professional women's basketball history concentrated on a single individual in the most publicly documented and the most institutionally sustained form that the Governance Accountability Coalition's most comprehensive response to any single conduct violation has produced. The specific dimensions of the meltdown, whatever its precise public expressions involve, reflect the specific ways in which the different institutional turning against forces have been experienced by the individual most directly at the center of each of them. The Accountability Coalition's turning against produces a specific form of institutional and competitive pressure whose personal experience is different from the experience of the WNBA's official governance turning against, which is different from the experience of the franchise organizational turning against, which is different from the experience of the basketball world's broadly public turning against, and the meltdown is the aggregate human response to all of those different institutional turning against experiences converging simultaneously in the most concentrated form that any individual in professional women's basketball has ever been required to navigate. Now let us talk about what it means specifically that the WNBA has turned on Carrington, because the institutional weight of the league's own governance apparatus formally turning against a specific individual through the official ban and the strongest message language is the most institutionally significant dimension of the turning against, and the one whose specific institutional meaning changes the governance accountability story in the most permanent and the most formally documented way. The WNBA turning on Carrington through the official ban is not simply the governance apparatus imposing the most severe disciplinary consequence available to it on an individual whose conduct exceeded what the league's competitive environment can accommodate. It is the league's most formal institutional statement that the specific conduct, the brutal attack on Cunningham, most severely expressed falls categorically outside the boundaries of the competitive environment the WNBA is institutionally responsible for maintaining. And the formal institutional turning against that the ban represents is the governance statement whose permanence and whose institutional weight exceeds the permanence and the institutional weight of every other turning against the meltdown is responding to simultaneously. The WNBA turning on Carrington means that the institution whose governance authority over the competitive environment the Accountability Coalition's governance accountability story has been most urgently requiring to exercise adequate disciplinary authority has formally and permanently done so in the most extreme form its governance framework provides, and the meltdown's response to that specific institutional turning against is the most institutionally revealing dimension of the meltdown, because it reflects how the individual at the center of the governance accountability story is processing the most formal and the most permanent institutional rejection of her competitive conduct that the league's governance authority can produce. Now let us talk about the specific human experience of a meltdown in the context of the most comprehensive simultaneous institutional turning against in professional women's basketball history, because this is the analytically significant layer that the governance framing of the mainstream coverage is most completely failing to engage with, and that requires the most honest and the most direct analytical attention to provide the complete picture of what the Carrington situation has produced in its most personally devastating dimension. The experience of being the individual at the center of a simultaneous institutional turning against that includes the league's official governance, the most commercially significant active voices in professional basketball, the franchise organization that employed you, and the basketball world's broad public response to the most severe physical incident the governance accountability story has produced is an experience that combines institutional, professional, personal, and competitive pressures in a form that the standard human frameworks for managing public criticism and institutional accountability were not designed to accommodate at the scale and the simultaneity the Carrington situation has produced. The meltdown is the human expression of those combined pressures exceeding whatever capacity the individual has for processing them within the frameworks of professional composure and institutional management that athletes in public professional roles typically deploy to manage the personal experience of institutional and public criticism. The specific form of the meltdown tells you something specific about which of the simultaneous turning against pressures is being experienced as most personally overwhelming and which institutional turning against dimension is producing the most personally devastating individual experience. And understanding the meltdown's form in those terms rather than simply as the dramatic behavior of an individual under institutional pressure is the analytical work that produces the most honest and the most institutionally complete account of what the comprehensive simultaneous turning against has meant for the individual at its center. Now let us zoom all the way out, because DiJonai Carrington's meltdown after the WNBA turns on her in the aftermath of the brutal attack on Sophie Cunningham is not simply the individual human response to the most comprehensive simultaneous institutional turning against in professional women's basketball history. It is the institutional event that most specifically and most humanly reveals what the governance accountability transformation the Clark era's most consequential governance season has been building toward means for the individuals whose specific conduct most severely expressed the governance failures the accountability story has been most urgently requiring the governance apparatus to formally address. The meltdown is the human face of the governance accountability transformation, the most personal and the most individually concentrated expression of what the comprehensive institutional turning against that adequate governance accountability produces means for the individuals at the center of the governance failures the transformation most urgently addresses. Every previous element of the governance accountability story this season, from the Accountability Coalition's institutional interventions to the league's disciplinary decisions to the franchise organizational accountability actions, has been analyzed primarily through the institutional and governance frameworks that the analytical focus of the accountability story most naturally foregrounds. The meltdown requires a different analytical framework, one that can simultaneously account for the institutional dimensions of the governance accountability transformation and the human dimensions of what the most comprehensive simultaneous turning against in professional women's basketball history means for the specific individual experiencing it in its most personally devastating form. Remember the most analytically significant moment of the meltdown that every outlet is treating as the most dramatically compelling? Here it is. The specific moment in the meltdown that is most analytically significant is not the most emotionally intense moment of the public expression, but the specific moment when the specific nature of what Carrington says or does most clearly reveals which dimension of the comprehensive institutional turning against is being experienced as the most personally overwhelming, because that revelation is the most direct available window into how the individual at the center of the most comprehensive institutional accountability response in women's basketball governance history is processing the full institutional and personal weight of the simultaneous turning against that the brutal attack on Cunningham has produced. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about the meltdown and why it matters beyond the immediate dramatic intensity of watching the individual at the center of the most comprehensive simultaneous institutional turning against in professional women's basketball history respond to the full weight of what that turning against means. The specific institutional lessons the meltdown teaches about what comprehensive simultaneous institutional accountability pressure does to the individuals whose conduct it is most directly addressing are the dimension of the story that has the most lasting implications for how the governance accountability transformation the Clark era's most consequential season has been building toward should be understood in its most complete institutional and human context. The governance accountability story has been analyzed throughout this season primarily through the institutional and commercial dimensions of the Accountability Coalition's demands and the governance apparatus's responses, and the analytical focus on those dimensions has produced the most comprehensive institutional analysis of the governance accountability transformation in women's basketball governance history. But the meltdown reveals that the governance accountability transformation also has a human dimension that the institutional analysis alone cannot capture, the dimension of what the comprehensive simultaneous accountability pressure the transformation requires means for the specific individuals whose conduct has most severely expressed the governance failures the transformation most urgently addresses. The institutional lessons the meltdown teaches about that human dimension are not lessons about the individual whose meltdown most directly reveals it but about the governance accountability transformation itself and what the most comprehensive simultaneous institutional turning against it requires means as a governance accountability instrument whose effectiveness and whose human implications have to be evaluated in their full institutional and human complexity rather than simply in their institutional governance and commercial dimensions. The second hidden angle is the specific effect of the meltdown on the governance accountability story's remaining institutional work, because the human dimension of the meltdown creates the specific institutional context in which the governance framework reforms that remain the most urgent outstanding governance accountability destination of the accountability story can be most publicly and most institutionally honestly connected to the human consequences of the governance failures they are. Designed to prevent .my verdict on the meltdown and the WNBA turning on Carrington is this, stated directly and with the full institutional and human complexity the situation requires. DiJonai Carrington's meltdown after the WNBA turns on her in the aftermath of the brutal attack on Sophie Cunningham is the most humanly revealing and the most institutionally complex single event in the Clark era's governance accountability story because it simultaneously produces the most personally devastating individual experience the comprehensive institutional turning against the governance accountability transformation requires has generated and the most direct available window into the human dimension of what the most comprehensive governance accountability response in professional women's basketball history means for the individuals whose conduct it is most directly addressing, and understanding the meltdown in its full institutional and human complexity requires analytical frameworks that can simultaneously account for the governance accountability transformation's institutional dimensions and the specific human experience of the comprehensive simultaneous turning against that the transformation's most comprehensive institutional responses produce. The first reason this verdict is correct is the institutional comprehensiveness of the turning against. The simultaneous institutional turning against from the league governance, the Accountability Coalition, the franchise organization, and the basketball world's broad public response is the most comprehensive institutional accountability response to any single individual conduct violation in professional women's basketball history. And the meltdown is the human expression of that institutional comprehensiveness concentrated in its most personally devastating individual form. The second reason is the human dimension the meltdown reveals. The meltdown's specific form reveals the human dimension of the governance accountability transformation that the institutional analysis alone cannot capture, producing the most important analytical insight about the complete human and institutional complexity of what the governance accountability transformation means that any single event in the accountability story has generated. The third reason is the governance accountability lessons it teaches. The specific institutional lessons the meltdown teaches about the human dimension of the comprehensive simultaneous institutional accountability pressure the governance accountability transformation requires are the most important analytical contributions the meltdown makes to the complete institutional and human understanding of the governance accountability transformation the Clark era's most consequential governance season has been building toward. The strongest counter-argument is that analyzing the meltdown as a governance accountability lesson risks treating the individual human experience of the most comprehensive institutional turning against in women's basketball governance history as an analytical instrument rather than engaging with it as the personal and human experience it most directly is, and that the most appropriate analytical approach to the meltdown is the one that most honestly and most directly engages with its human dimensions without subordinating them to the governance accountability framing the institutional analysis most naturally foregrounds. That argument has genuine merit as a human dignity concern. The counter to the counter is that the analytical framework that most completely accounts for both the institutional and the human dimensions of the meltdown is not one that subordinates either dimension to the other but one that simultaneously engages with both in the specific complementary form that the most institutionally complete and the most humanly honest account of the governance accountability transformation's most personally revealing single event requires. So tell me in the comments right now, does the meltdown and the WNBA's comprehensive simultaneous turning against Carrington represent the most complete institutional accountability the Clark-era's governance accountability story has produced, or does the human dimension of what the comprehensive turning against means for the individual at its center require a more nuanced institutional and human accountability framework than the governance accountability story's institutional analysis alone can provide? Drop your answer, because this is the question that most completely reveals the human and institutional complexity of the most consequential governance accountability transformation women's basketball has ever produced. Here are my 3 predictions. First prediction: the specific institutional response to the meltdown from at least one member of the Accountability Coalition within 1 week acknowledges both the institutional accountability dimensions of the governance accountability transformation the comprehensive turning against represents and the human dimensions of what the most comprehensive simultaneous institutional turning against in women's basketball governance history means for the individual whose meltdown most directly reveals them, producing the most institutionally complete and the most humanly honest single accountability coalition communication the governance accountability story has generated. High confidence, because the human dimension of the meltdown creates the institutional context in which the accountability coalition's most institutionally sophisticated voices are most directly required to demonstrate that the governance accountability transformation they have been advocating for understands and accounts for its full human complexity rather than simply its institutional and governance dimensions. Second prediction: the governance apparatus makes a formal institutional communication within 2 weeks of the meltdown that specifically acknowledges the human dimension of the comprehensive simultaneous institutional turning against the official ban represents while formally maintaining the institutional accountability the ban most directly addresses, producing the governance apparatus's most institutionally complete and most humanly honest single governance communication about the Carrington situation and its implications for the governance accountability transformation. Medium confidence, because the institutional incentive for a governance communication that accounts for the human dimension of the official ban's comprehensive institutional turning against is real but depends on governance communication decisions that are not predictable from the outside even when the institutional logic of such a communication is clear. Third prediction, and this is the bold one: the meltdown and the WNBA's comprehensive simultaneous turning against Carrington produced the most important governance accountability document the Clark era's most consequential season has generated, a formal institutional communication that simultaneously addresses the governance accountability transformation's institutional dimensions, the human dimensions of the comprehensive simultaneous institutional turning against the transformation's most comprehensive responses produce, and the specific governance framework reforms that preventing the recurrence of the governance failures the Carrington assault most severely expressed requires, and that document becomes the institutional foundation for the most humanly complete and the most institutionally comprehensive governance accountability framework in women's basketball governance history. Low confidence on the specific timeline and the specific institutional form, because governance documents of this institutional comprehensiveness require processes that cannot be predicted with confidence, but the conditions the meltdown and the WNBA's turning against Carrington together have created are more favorable to exactly this kind of institutionally comprehensive and humanly complete governance accountability document than any previous single event in the Clark era's governance accountability story has produced. Remember that most analytically significant meltdown moment? The specific moment where the nature of what Carrington says or does most clearly reveals which dimension of the comprehensive institutional turning against is being experienced as most personally overwhelming is the analytical key to understanding